Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism, narcissistic relationships, healing from narcissistic relationships, and all the questions you've got. One big one is always around closure, right? Closure. It's funny, when I think about closure, one of the first places I go are movies, television, even books we read, right? I think so many times part of the reason we get drawn to certain stories is that there's a comfort when at the end of the film, there's closure. The villain goes to jail. The bad guy gets shot before he could shoot someone else. The person who struggled wins a prize or has the happy ending or whatever it may be, right? And I honestly think the reason those films are so entertaining is there's a tension that goes away for us. We're like, justice is served, right? And it's why sometimes we can even watch the same movie over and over again, because there's a real tension reduction that comes from, and this story ended just the way I wanted it to end. What we don't do well is when a story, film, anything ends in sort of an unjust way. And any of you who have ever sat in a focus group where they're trying to decide which ending they want for a film, a classical example would be, if I remember reading articles about Pretty Woman. And originally in Pretty Woman, they were actually not going to have the man and woman come together, which actually would have been a far more realistic ending. Even more realistic, it would have been that the woman, Julia Roberts' character, ended up sort of strung out on drugs and probably died prematurely. Not the ending people wanted. So they end up together, right? But so sometimes writers are even made to sort of shift endings, even when they're based on books. They will change the ending to make it more movie palatable, right? And I know this personally, that for me, a real healing, like when I'm really having a bad day, I will pick up what I consider a just TV show or a just book or a just movie so I can see the justice happen at the end, because it will actually calm me down. So I'm giving this all meant to say, we love us some closure. Guess where closure almost never happens? Narcissistic relationships. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the key ones is that they never really apologize, right? We see this happen in the public sphere all the time. Celebrities give apologies that were written by moderately literate publicists. And in general, they often don't reflect on the pain of the person they harmed. It's like, I'm sorry, and I know I did something wrong, and I need help. But never like, and I harmed someone, right? Because there's probably, in addition to that silly publicist, an attorney saying, well, don't say that, don't say that, right? So these aren't sincere apologies. Whether it's a fancy famous person making some sort of public apology, or whether it's just a regular person in your life, getting a sincere, genuine apology from a narcissistic person is impossible. And the reason is, to be able to apologize sincerely, you actually have to be attuned and plugged in to the pain and the harm you caused to another person, and then be willing to see your role in it, and then commit to not doing it again, and still acknowledging their pain. That's a lot of thens. And a narcissistic person is simply not capable of it, which is why an apology from a narcissistic person feels like empty calories, and you don't feel closure at the end. At the most of it, it almost feels like their mother sent them next door to come apologize to you. It doesn't feel like it's authentic. It feels like a third party told them to apologize. The workplace required them to apologize, but it's not coming from them. So we don't get real apologies. The second thing is, adding, sort of building on that, is you don't get any real accountability. Now, obviously, a good apology is based on real accountability, but there's never responsibility taking. There's never accountability taking. By the time it's done, if you really were to peel back the layers of the onion of your narcissistic conversation, especially if something went wrong and they're responsible for why it went wrong, or they're responsible for the harm, you'll still see that the odds are is that they never fully took accountability or responsibility. And again, it's very difficult to have closure if the person who was responsible or accountable for something going wrong didn't take responsibility for it. Instead, they make excuses, or they're defensive, or they push back. There's no closure. You may still be hurt if something happened, but if someone took accountability or responsibility, at least you don't feel gaslighted. At least you don't feel like you're losing your mind. And that right there just that sense of like, okay, there's not something wrong with me. They did take responsibility. I'm still incensed, but they owned it. Now you get to feel sane. And that at least is a step closer to closure. So you have that piece of it. A big contributor to the lack of closure, though, frankly, is that narcissistic people seem to move on into new lives like that. Okay, so let's use the intimate partner kind of an example. By and large, when a narcissistic person ends a relationship with you, they've got their new supply teed up. They do. And I'm not saying that non-narcissistic people don't do this too, sure, but narcissistic people almost always do. They're not going out into a world of no supply. So they're going to make sure they've got whatever it is they've got set up. It's sort of set up. So they're getting it all set up. And then they will make, I'm just sort of mentally kind of going through 10 to 15 narcissistic breakup stories I've heard recently. Every single one of them had a new supply lined up. And so, well, that's the opposite of closure. When you see that you've been left, many times you feel completely taken out by it. You're kind of surprised by it. You still thought there was something to talk about. And then you come to find out they're already in someone else's arms. And you're like, oh, now it all makes sense. No closure. Now just rage and grief and more rage and anger on your part of, oh my gosh. And then there's no apology, no accountability. And my favorite is when it's clear there was an overlap. The narcissistic person doesn't just own it and say, yep, I did that. You're broken up now. And they won't own it. And they will literally double, triple, and quadruple down on the idea there was never an overlap. There was never an overlap. Folks, there was an overlap. And so you don't conveniently break up with someone on a Monday and find your new person on a Tuesday. That ain't how the world works. So that idea that they could just move into something like that, and you're struggling, and they're not taking responsibility, and they're not even copping to the truth, that is a very difficult circumstance under which to find closure. And while that's in intimate relationships, we see the most sort of clear example of that, even in family relationships, when it's very clear a family member did something harmful or cruel or or deceitful or betraying or any of that, and the family still rallies around them. It's hard to feel closure in those circumstances. I've even heard people say where they've seen sort of marriages where the narcissistic partner far outlived the non-narcissistic partner. And they'll say, this doesn't feel right to me. I have no closure. Like, this doesn't feel fair. When we don't have closure, things feel unjust. They feel unfair. And they feel unsettling, like as though you're never quite comfortable. Like, this just doesn't feel right. It feels as though the narcissistic person in a way is getting away with something. And that's the languaging I hear from a lot of people will say, I just want closure on this. And it's a tricky bit, right? Because when you think about other relationships when we've had closure, it might be that you had the goodbye conversation. And while you might have been sad, with healthy relationships, when you break up, sometimes you end it because you live too far away, or your lives are too different, or the timing was wrong. That can feel like closure. When you say, gosh, if this had been a different time, it would have been so different. And I'm so glad I met them, but we couldn't make it work. That then we don't feel as tense and fractured, and that nagging, unjust, unfair sense that can really fuel a lot of rumination. Do people ever get closure in narcissistic relationships? Sometimes, but as I've often said, sometimes you get your closure either when you no longer need it. So much time has passed that when you find out that the new person left them, or the new person cheated on them, or they lost all their money, or whatever it is, you're sort of like, I just don't care anymore, whatever, who cares? And so there might be a tiny bit of closure, but honestly, you needed all that news probably many years before. So there might be sort of an ending that comes down the road that you hear about. Every so often, that ending might come sooner, so someone's not waiting so long, so you're healing and growing, and then you come to find out maybe 6 months after a breakup that the narcissistic person's trying to hoover you, and you come to find out they're hoovering you because the next person saw what a piece of, what they were and ended the relationship with them. That can certainly help with closure. But folks, I know it's hard to hear this, but the closure comes from you're not having to deal with them anymore. And when you stop to think about the bandwidth, the time, the lightness, the freedom that comes from not having to deal with them anymore. While it can feel terribly unfair that they get to move forward, you got to remember, you're living under a very different playbook than them. For them, relationships are shallow. They exist to validate only them, that they are superficial, that they're associated with status. That's not what you signed up for. So when they find something quickly, when things work out for them quickly, it's often because their idea of something working is much more shallow than what is meaningful to you. You're not playing the same game. You're not living in the same way. But I get it. I get it. And if I had one wish, is that every survivor would get closure a lot faster. But I'll tell you though, let me put this in as the punchline of this video. I'm not so sure that would be great either. Because I got to be frank with you. If some people, their narcissistic person got their sort of comeuppance too quickly, because you may not have had a chance to heal yet, you might have taken them back too. Oh, I feel bad. Well, see, like, they'll be so happy to be with me again. Maybe we need to tough it out for a while so we heal. So by the time the narcissistic person gets kicked to the curb and might come crawling back, that you're too strong to take them back. And let me tell you, there's no closure that feels better than that. Good luck.